How are you?
Good.
How's life?
Great.
What's happening? How you doing? Have you been asked any of these questions today? Probably a few times, right? Doesn't matter if it's an old friend, if it's a work acquaintance, a complete stranger. Doesn't matter what country you're in. Doesn't matter what language you speak. Basically, the gesture remains the same. You're asking them to give you a story. So when I was growing up, bedtime was basically non-negotiable. My parents would say things like, you need to be refreshed for tomorrow. You need to be on target. Bedtime for bonzo. Now, sound parental advice, without a doubt, which made it even more special when I was allowed to stay up late. And one of those nights happened when I was 6 and my sister was about 2.5. At the time, I lived in a ranch-style house backed up to a farm with beautiful dark skies. Now, one night, my parents bundled my sister and I up, took us out to the front yard, and directed our attention up to the sky. Now, I have to admit, I don't remember much about that night. It was about 3 decades ago. But I do remember when I was 6, I was obsessed with 2 things, dinosaurs and the solar system. Now, there really weren't any chances to see dinosaurs that night, but there was an opportunity to see a comet, and I was incredibly excited. For those of you who are familiar with Halley's Comet, know that it is one of the most famous comets. It can be seen with the naked eye, and it comes back every 75 years because of its orbit, right? Now, staring up at that sky that night, I can have a vivid memory of what I wanted that comet to look like. I saw it, and it was blazed across the sky, brilliant white. But unfortunately, I have no recollection of what that comet actually looked like. But somehow it left this lasting impression on me. Somewhere in my 6-year-old brain, I knew that that comet was on its way out to the outer edges of our solar system. I could visualize the 9 planets. I had posters up on my wall. And my parents told me that when it got to the edges of that solar system, that it would slowly turn around and make its way back. Now, it was that arc, that trajectory, that my brain latched onto, and I remember asking my parents, so when it comes back, we'll watch it again, right? To which my mom replied, well, maybe you'll watch it with your children or your children's children, but your father and I will probably be gone by then. Now, the story of the comet has stuck with me all of these years. And I've come to see it as a reminder that my life will fit within the arc of that comet. I might not have gotten it that night, but years later, I've come to see that my life will fit within the arc of that comet. I will grow up, I'll live my life, I'll experience happiness and sadness, and I'll grow old, and if I'm lucky, I would see the comet again. And I realized that was one of the most important moments of my life. My adventures would be coming to an end. You see, the story of the comet is a personal story. It exists in my imagination and my imagination alone. And it reminds me that my time is finite. It encourages me to take advantage of all that I can, because the comet is always moving, and it will return one day. So I stand here, not as an astronomer, but as a documentary storyteller. Maybe that's why I remember the story of the comet and not the comet itself. Documentary storytellers restructure life into poignant stories. And we do this because stories have the power to move audiences to think and act differently. In a way, we are all documentary storytellers. We all structure life. We all restructure life to make sense. We all use story to connect with others. And we all are influenced by the stories we tell more than we can ever realize. In fact, our existence is so saturated in story that we often don't recognize our relationship to it. How might our lives be different if we knew what stories did to us, if we knew what stories did for us? Now, story and narrative are words that are thrown around a lot, and they can mean different things in different conversations. Not everything that pops into my head, not everything that comes out of my mouth is a story. Words, language, ideas are how we think, but story is often how we link those concepts together. And we're doing that instantaneously, but we also re-edit and revise as new experiences emerge. Now, a narrative becomes a story when it enters the collective imagination of an audience. Good stories leave space for us to bring our own experiences in. Now, we can give new meanings to those stories. And that's why people can experience different things, but then walk away with different stories. Now, stories can exist and exert power in one of two places. One, they can exert power in our imagination and our imagination alone. Those are called personal stories. The story of the comet is a personal story. It exists only in my imagination. And then there's collective stories. Collective stories exist in our interconnected network of imaginations. Both of those stories can exert a force onto us. I'm going to talk about collective stories in a bit, but I'd like to dive a little bit deeper into personal stories. Now, what I have up here is a picture that I drew around the same time that the story of the comet takes place. Now, as I drew this, I must have thought, this is me, this is my mother, this is my father, he has a beard, this is my sister, she is smaller than me. This is my family, I am loved. I have other pictures around this time that reveal the house that I grew up in, the subjects that I was good at, the things that I wanted to be, the places that I visited. At this time, I was beginning to transform my experiences into a story. I was curating what I heard, I was creating connections, and I was internalizing that story. Narrative psychologists call this our narrative identity. And I think, how crucial were those moments when I was creating that story, and how long they've lasted with me. The next time that you have the opportunity to spend time with a small child, remember that they are inventing themselves in part from the stories that you share. The next time you have opportunities to draw with a small child, think about what are the stories that they are weaving. Luckily, the stories that we create when we're children don't stay with us forever. Shy children can grow up into assertive adults. Self-centered teenagers can grow compassion. The confidences of youth can fade. The truth is, we can change our story, not just once or twice, but any time that we want. In fact, I've changed it a number of times. This right here is a picture of my journals. It's here that my story has evolved through the years. This is the playground where I take experiences and rework it into my story. Now, that really wasn't the purpose when I started journaling, but it's been a corollary. And I think about going back over these journals, but I don't do that all that often. But when I do, I'm often surprised. It's kind of like coming across a picture of yourself maybe 10 or 15 years ago, where you recognize who you were, but you also acknowledge what you are no longer. There's this myth that life acts upon us, that we are the sum of our experiences. But that's simply, I just don't think that's true. I think it's how we react to life. It's how we weave those experiences into story that makes us who we are. Now, personal stories can help create our individual identity, and collective stories help to shape our shared humanity. In order to understand collective stories, I think we need to go way back to when humans first started mixing hematite and animal fat and started painting on cave walls. You see, for the vast majority of our history on this planet, modern history, there really wasn't anything special about us. We weren't the largest, the fastest, the strongest, or even the highest on the food chain. Our use of tools was important, but there were other animals that used tools. Our control of fire was a significant achievement, but it really didn't set us apart. What set us apart really came about and emerged around the same time that these cave paintings first appeared, and it really set us on a completely different trajectory. Although scientists disagree why, around 40 to 70,000 years ago, our brains began to grow. And as our brains grew, our language became more complex. See, before this time, humans could talk about things that physically existed. We can communicate about food and predators. But as our brains grew, we were able to communicate about things that did not exist. For instance, spirits, ideals, values, God. And when humans linked things real with imaginary, we've discovered what really set us apart: the ability to share stories. Because it was stories that allowed us to cooperate with massive amounts of other humans. Without that coordinated cooperation, we were just another primate. It was the ability for us to share visions, values, morals with a large amount of other humans that allowed us to build trust with them to accomplish things. So with that trust, we built towns and cities, and we built empires and religions. We were able to maintain a faith in the divine. We were able to feel compassion in others. We were able, really, to build the world the way that it is. So collective stories help to build that world, but then it also helped to develop the framework for which we would live within it. You see, about 500 years ago, if you were walking down the street and you stopped someone and you asked them, what is it that humans don't know that we should? They probably would have thought you were a little crazy, but they would have answered, nothing. There's nothing that we don't know that we should. And for the framework that they were living in, that was actually true. Because most of the way that we thought was that God or one of his servants or prophets had basically distilled a lot of the knowledge that we needed to live. And the questions that we didn't know, so for instance, why is the sky blue, was really just considered unimportant. Or we could say because it was made that way. But this collective story about the foundations of our knowledge was beginning to change. The scientific revolution was afoot. And the story of the scientific revolution told us we didn't really know much at all. In fact, we didn't even know the questions to ask. So consider those two collective stories that are vying for our attention in our collective imagination. The story, one of those stories, basically tells us that we have the answers to all that you seek. The other is based on its willingness to admit ignorance. One is a story of everything that we can imagine. The other is a story of what we can observe through repeatable experiments. One requires our faith in the divine, and the other requires our faith in progress. About 150 years ago, Charles Darwin published On the Origin of the Species, a radical news story that entered our collective imagination. It talked about natural selection, adaptation, and universal connectedness. And slowly, the existing story that was prevalent of divine creator and an unchanging world began to fade and change itself. Now, the world was really the same world before the story of evolution and after the story of evolution. In fact, humans really weren't physically any different. But those two stories exerted two very different forces on humanity. See, biologic essentialism basically tells us that the world is unchanging and that we live within a hierarchy. And you look at most human institutions up to that point and even during that point, and they reflected this idea and this story. In fact, if you asked people, was there anything wrong with that, they would have said, no, that's just the way the world is. But the story of evolution was different. story of evolution told us that things change and that our future isn't predetermined. In fact, change is inevitable. Soon, we realized that the value systems they have were different. And we started to give more clout to having the ability to be flexible and adaptable. Now, both of these stories exist still within us. And some see this shift from divine dependence into the ability to adapt for survival as incredibly exciting and liberating. And others see it as a terrifying breakdown. How you see it depends on your relationship to the story. Now, collective stories have built this world for us, helped to build us this world. Collective stories have helped us to acquire a framework of how to live within them. And collective stories has also helped us to relate to one another. So in our hyper-connected world, it is incredibly important to allow groups of people to work and articulate their experiences into collective stories and to share them. And it is incredibly important for us to seek out those collective stories that are different from us. When stories aren't worked into, when experience isn't worked into these kinds of stories and articulated and shared, then this comes up later as political upheaval and violence and fundamentalism. But when groups of people have time to work those stories out and share them, healing happens. Now, we need to leave room for these stories because we really do suffer from hunger and violence, but it's the story of poverty and war that linger for generations afterwards. We can remember the story of the comet, even if we can't remember the comet. So for a long time, humans have wanted to know our place in this world. It's not an easy question. Perhaps we can start is by understanding and at least recognizing the stories that we cultivate. Personal stories not only help us to think about who we are, but they help guide us to who we become. Collective stories not only shape our shared humanity, but they also set the limits for our potential. So I leave you with this. Recognize your complicated relationship with story. In those moments, you will be better equipped to connect with others and to understand yourself. When you ask someone, "How are you? How's it going?" remember, you are asking them to share a story with you. And listen close, because stories are essential to humans. They have made us who we are, and they will be part of our future. But it takes us to give them that power. Thank you.